Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. So today I wanted to talk about the recent incident in New York City where a man was strangled to death on the subway by a fellow passenger. And that incident certainly has evoked a lot of controversy and discussion. As of the time that I'm recording this, the person who committed the homicide, whose name is Daniel um, Daniel Penny, killed Jordan Neely. Penny has just been charged with involuntary manslaughter, and so we'll see how the case proceeds. But what I wanted to do today was, first of all, give you a brief summary of the case, uh, of the incident, and talk about my own view on it, and also share with you the views of a couple of people who are familiar with a particular martial arts technique that Daniel Penny used to restrain and ultimately choke to death Jordan Neely. So, first of all, let's just have a look at a brief summary of the incident. So this took place on the New York subway system on May 1st, 2023, around 2:30 p.m. Jordan Neely, a homeless 30-year-old black man, was killed by Daniel Penny, a 24-year-old white man, who placed him in a chokehold while they were riding the F train in Manhattan on the New York City subway. At least two others restrained Neely's limbs. Freelance journalist and witness Juan Alberto Vasquez recorded video of the incident. According to police, witnesses said Neely was acting in a hostile and erratic manner, yelling that he was hungry and thirsty, that he would hurt anyone on the train. I'm not sure exactly what that means. That he did not mind going to jail or getting life in prison and was ready to die. Vasquez said that Neely did not physically attack anyone, but other witnesses reported him throwing trash at passengers. Penny approached Neely from behind, placing him in a chokehold. According to Vasquez, the chokehold lasted for 15 minutes, 3 minutes of which Vasquez recorded on video. An onlooker alerted Penny that Neely had defecated, a warning sign he was dying. The onlooker then said, "You're gonna kill him." And then he was pronounced dead shortly after the police arrived, and he was taken to the hospital. But he probably died, from what I can gather, at some point relatively early on in the incident. So, so basically, he was hostile and erratic, and according to some witnesses, threw trash at people. And by the way, Neely was, and I'm not going to show a video of this incident, first of all, because YouTube might try to censor me, and secondly, it's pretty tough to watch, so you can certainly look it up for yourself. But in any case, one thing notable about this incident is that Jordan Neely was a black man and Daniel Penny was white. So, one thing I have to wonder, and I don't know the answer to this, but one thing certainly I have to wonder is, has there ever been a case of a black man choking a white man to death right out in public, like on the subway, for example? And I've never heard of one. So this person, journalist Richard Sudan, among other things, asked basically that question, and his view was that if Neely had been white, hungry, and homeless, and behaving in the exact same way on the train, I think he'd still be alive. I'll go one further. If Jordan Neely was white, Daniel Penny would not have even laid a finger on him. He would certainly not have viewed him as a threat. Now, obviously, we can't know what would have happened if the roles had been reversed, if it had been Jordan Neely that choked Daniel, or if Daniel Penny had been the one behaving erratically and arguably aggressively on the subway, and Jordan Neely tried to restrain him. In fact, would Jordan Neely have done anything to him? So this person thinks, if Jordan Neely was white, Daniel Penny would not even have laid a finger on him. He would certainly have not have viewed him as a threat. Instead, Penny became the judge, jury, and ultimately executioner of Neely, a black homeless man who epitomized vulnerability in a system of injustice in America. Okay, so regardless of whatever you think about that, I think there's several basic questions that we ought to try and answer about this killing. One, under what circumstances is it justifiable for either the police or a citizen to use force? And secondly, was it such a circumstance? And the third question we can ask is, if it is, then what kind of force? And lastly, is Neely's defense believable? His attorneys have released a statement regarding the incident, claiming that he hadn't intended at all to hurt Neely. So let's take a look at that first of all. The man who held Jordan Neely in a fatal chokehold never intended to harm him, his attorneys say. Amid mounting pressures to charge the man who restrained Jordan Neely in a fatal chokehold, which he has been charged with involuntary manslaughter now, on a New York City subway train car this week, the man's attorneys contend he didn't foresee the awful tragedy which has sparked protests and further accentuated the city's struggles with homelessness and mental illness. And so they say, we would first like to express on behalf of Daniel Penny our condolences to those close to Mr. Neely, the law firm of Razor and Kenneth said in a statement. When Mr. Neely began aggressively threatening Daniel Penny and the other passengers, Danny, with the help of others, acted to protect themselves until help arrived. Daniel never intended to harm Mr. Neely and could not have foreseen his untimely death, the statement said. We hope that out of this awful tragedy will come a new commitment by our elected officials to address the mental health crisis on our streets and subways. And just to briefly note that Mr. Neely did have a long history of mental illness. In 2007, when he was 14 years old, his mother was murdered. Ironically, by strangling. And his mother's body was later found in a suitcase. It was really a brutal murder, and he was certainly traumatized by this, and he's, as a result, had issues with depression and substance abuse, and apparently also had schizophrenia, and he does have a criminal record. He has a rap sheet about 40 counts long, the overwhelming majority of them non-violent incidents, such as jumping the turnstile and stealing rides on the subway. But he did have a couple of occasions where he assaulted people. So although certainly these sorts of incidents can be attributed to his mental illness, it's not like he was some squeaky clean angel, but that isn't really, his past isn't really relevant here, because obviously Daniel Penny didn't know anything about his past. All he knew was what he saw there in front of him. And there's lots of conflicting reports about that, but certainly the person who took the video, who witnessed the whole thing, said he didn't see any aggressive action on the part of Neely. And it was actually a video taken. Excuse me, where is it? I thought I had it saved, but maybe not. Oh, here we go. Jesus, why is it taking so long? Okay, so here is a video of Neely, just um, moments before Penny choked him. Let me switch this over. Okay, so there you see Neely.
Homeless man, I need to shelter and drink. Food, thirsty in the milk. TV Popeyes, thirsty in the shelter. Milk, TV and drink, and that's the happy. Thirsty in the milk, food hungry, and that's what's going on. Shelter and drink, thirsty in the milk. Food, TV, Popeyes. Thirsty in the drink, TV, milk, thirsty in the food. Drink hungry, I need to survive. Milk, shelter. Drink hungry, and that's what happens.
Okay, so it's hard to make out much of what he's saying, but he mentions about how he's thirsty and hungry. In this particular video clip, he didn't move in an aggressive manner toward anyone. He was just sort of shuffling in place and muttering. And some witnesses say he threw trash at people. Some witnesses say he threatened people. But we don't see that here. But I guess one thing to question about Penny's claim, or the claim that his attorneys made on his behalf, that he was acting in defense of himself and the other people there who felt threatened. It's really hard to take his claim that he felt threatened seriously, because he was an ex-Marine who had martial arts training, was in good shape, seemed certainly perfectly capable of defending himself. There seems little doubt about that. He had martial arts training. He could easily have defended himself. And, again, some have brought up Neely's history, which did include some, a few violent incidents, but that's not relevant here because Penny didn't know his history. And, aggressively threatening is really a matter of interpretation. I certainly didn't, in that brief video clip, see any example of that. Now, what about the claim that Penny didn't mean to hurt Neely? Okay, well, let's take a look at that. First of all, let's have a look at this thread by a judo instructor who described Penny's action as murder. He was charged with manslaughter. This judo coach says he thought it was murder, and here's why. He says, I'm a U.S. Judo Federation certified judo coach and first-degree black belt. I teach chokes safely to beginners all the time. And in this thread, I'm going to walk you through how Daniel Penny chose to kill Jordan Neely, and it was extremely unlikely that he didn't know what he was doing. Content warning, explicit discussions and photos of a murder. The murder began with Penny pulling Neely to the ground and placing him in a position called back mount. Feet hooked around the thighs, clinging to the victim's back like a backpack. This is considered a dominant position in judo because the person it's being applied on has no offensive options and can't take any until they escape, including strikes. Those backwards elbows taught in the self-defense class at your local Y are unlikely to work. This already shows that Penny wasn't an untrained person flailing around, but someone with significant grappling training. If Penny's intent had just been to restrain Neely, He could have maintained that position and moved his hands to an even more dominant position, such as the seatbelt grip. See image. I guess that's what that is. So there's no choke being applied there, because the right arm is underneath his arm. He didn't choose to do that. He chose to murder Neely by applying a choke instead. First, we should answer, what is a choke? It's a technique where pressure is applied to the carotid arteries on the side of the neck, causing oxygen deprivation to the brain, which causes it to shut down. In all chokes, if applied correctly, unconsciousness results in about 6 to 12 seconds, as the brain rapidly shuts down consciousness to preserve itself in the low oxygen state it finds itself in. Okay, so just briefly here, let me show you a short video clip of a UFC heavyweight champion, Jonathan Jones, demonstrating the exact choke that Daniel Penny applied to Jordan Neely, and you'll see how quickly the guy passes out. The sound here is just a bunch of music, so it's not relevant. I'm just going to play the video. Okay, so all right, watch the time here. Okay, so he's just doing a demonstration to show how it works. Okay, so they're applying it right here, 12 seconds. Okay, so you saw he was holding up his arms so the guy could keep tabs on, when he passed out. And you saw his arms drop at about 23 seconds, so, it was, around 10 seconds. Not very long at all. Neely could have done that. He could have just applied, assuming that he was as well trained as this guy, or as anybody who knows what they're doing. He could have made Neely, Penny could have made Neely pass out in around 10 seconds, and he would have obviously come to eventually, assuming nothing went wrong. But that's all he would have had to do, or really much less than that. But if he had used a chokehold, and let go in 10 seconds, the guy would not have been able to hurt anybody. Okay, back to this thread. Chokes. Okay. All right, let's go down here. The specific choke Penny used was called a rear naked choke. In order to apply it, you have to play your arms in a very specific way around your partner's neck and head. One hand, usually the right, snakes across their neck and grabs the bicep of the other arm. That other arm pushes the back of their head forward. So you can see the guy's head is being pushed, his throat is being, or neck is being pushed into the guy's right forearm. They also use their head to also push the guys forward. This arm position is virtually impossible to do accidentally. Pressure is then applied by flexing one's arms, shoulders, and back, and using one's head as an assist if needed. Effectively, the entire force of the body is used against the neck of the victim. This is a tremendously secure grip, and for this reason, when it gets to this point in MMA competition, in 99 out of 100 cases, the match is over and the other fighter taps out, meaning they lose consciousness. It is at this point at which you should always stop in training. If I saw a student applying a choke past that point in my dojo, they would be told to leave immediately and never come back. What happens after? Here's where the thread starts to get really gruesome. Several things happen as unconsciousness sets in. The victim goes limp and usually begins to gurgle, sometimes progressing to gasping. They may empty their bowels, and some of the witnesses to the choke of Jordan Neely said they heard and saw and smelled his bowels releasing. If the choke is immediately released, the victim will usually wake up in about 10 seconds. After waking, they will often be confused and may have short-term memory loss about the time of the choke itself. They may twitch or spasm. In most cases, this is considered relatively safe, if you only do it long enough for the person to pass out. Um, However, if the victim has a complicating health condition, of which about 25% of the population does, strokes or other medical complications may happen. Any finished choke, i.e., resulting in unconsciousness, is potentially lethal. Daniel Penny held on past this point. He would have heard Neely's gurgling and felt him go limp, signs everyone who trains is taught to look for in their training partner. He would have felt all tension go out of his body as his muscles stopped working. He did not release his grip on the rear naked choke. At about 2 minutes, assuming that the technique is executed properly, the victim is almost always dead. Penny held on past this point. It's not clear how long. The video that the guy took that it started sometime into it lasted about 3 minutes. He would have felt Neely's breath and pulse stop, because his arms are right there on the carotid artery. He probably felt his bowels loosen. He did not release the rear naked choke. He held on to this position for a reported 15 total minutes. So, we don't know exactly how long it was, but that's a guesstimate of some of the witnesses, including the videographer. Daniel Penny murdered Jordan Neely, and he knew what he was doing every step of the way, this judo coach says. Okay, so that's one view by someone who's an expert on using judo techniques or martial arts techniques such as the chokehold. All right, let's also take a look here at a Marine, who one of Mr. Penny's fellow Marines. I think this guy is Gabriel Murphy, is still in the Marines, whereas Penny is a Marine veteran. So I'll get to the petition in a minute, but he takes apart the statement I read you from the defense lawyers. When Mr. Neely began aggressively threatening Daniel Penny and the other passengers, Daniel, with the help of others, acted to protect themselves until help arrived. Daniel never intended to harm Mr. Neely and could not have foreseen his untimely death. So, Mr. Murphy responds, "Nonsense like this is exactly why I started this petition. Those statements are disingenuous at best and outright false at worst. Preemptive defense is another term for attack, and I'm aware of no evidence that contradicts my belief that Mr. Penny initiated the actual violence." In other words, Neely didn't, although he threw some stuff at people and had some arguably hostile words, he didn't lay a finger on anybody. I also don't think they can credibly claim that Mr. Penny could not have foreseen the outcome. The choke he used is explicitly taught as potentially lethal, and the copy of the Marine Corps martial arts program, manual I have specifies that during training it should never be applied with full force, never applied for more than 5 seconds, and must be released immediately upon tap out, upon someone passing out. Something I'd like to be extremely clear about is this: every Marine is taught how to do what Mr. Penny did, and every Marine is taught not to do it. This is a fundamental technique taught in basic training, and the idea that Mr. Penny somehow forgot that it can be lethal is extremely far-fetched, especially since it was a technique he chose to initiate contact with. In other words, there were other ways of restraining Mr. Neely that he could have used, and he didn't. Mr. Penny's actions were completely indefensible and are not representative of the people I served with. Mr. Penny is an embarrassing reflection on the military community as a whole and U.S. Marine Corps veterans in particular. He knew what he was doing could be fatal. He chose to do it anyway, and he must be held accountable for his actions, he says. Okay, so that explains his motivation for the petition. Let me quickly read through the petition that he put together, which at this point has 7,539 signatures. A man named Jordan Neely died after being placed in a choke by an unnamed individual who we now know is Daniel Penny, who had been identified as a former United States Marine. The individual knew or should have known that their actions would reasonably cause the death of Mr. Neely and should be prosecuted for murder. I am a former U.S. Marine Corps infantryman and combat veteran, which I include in this petition because this country has a great deal of respect for and deference to the military. I have already seen that respect and deference begin to be misapplied in this case. These actions are not how I was trained, not how my command expected me to act, and do not meet the level of professionalism that is incumbent on service members. The individual who choked Mr. Neely to death should be prosecuted for murder, and I hope that the military community joins me in disavowing the actions of this individual. All Marines are trained to the tan belt level in the Marine Corps Martial Arts program during basic training. The tan belt includes training on rear chokes, including an explicit admonition that rear chokes can be lethal and that an effective choke should take, in other words, one that causes the other person to pass out, should take 8 to 13 seconds. The descriptions and video available indicate that the choke was maintained for much longer than 13 seconds and continued after Mr. Neely ceased to offer resistance. Based on the available video and descriptions, it appears that the individual who choked Mr. Neely chose to initiate a potentially lethal technique in a tense but non-violent situation. It is probable that he received formal instruction on the technique, including the fact that it was potentially lethal if held for more than several seconds. He chose to continue for several minutes, which caused the death of Mr. Neely. Okay, so the other question that I wanted to address in this video is, under what circumstances is it justifiable for someone, whether it be the police or a private citizen like Mr. Penny, to use force? And was this such a circumstance? I think we've already established that it probably wasn't. But let's see what Gabriel Murphy, the person who started this position, has to say about circumstances where the use of force might be justifiable. And he's not a lawyer, but he's characterized this in terms of what the law says. Part of the discussion online seems to have pivoted to Mr. Neely's past, but the particulars of Mr. Neely's history are completely irrelevant here. There's a larger conversation to be had about the criminalization of homelessness, but he wants to sidestep that and come up with a hypothetical scenario that is more extreme than what might possibly have actually happened, and looking at that to see if we can draw any conclusions. Let's imagine that Captain America, bastion of moral goodness, is on the subway with Batty McBad Guy, professional bad guy, and some members of the public. And let's look at two questions. One, when is it okay for Captain America to use force against Batty McBad Guy? And two, after Batty McBad Guy is unconscious, when is it okay for Captain America to continue to choke Batty McBad Guy? Okay, so for the first question, Section 35 of the New York Penal Code says there are a variety of situations where the use of force, including deadly force, is authorized. All of them center on the concept of stopping Batty McBad Guy from doing something he was either about to do or is already doing, such as attacking another person. Again, I am not a lawyer, but as far as I know, these are laws that authorize the use of force in New York. Unless otherwise limited by the ensuing provisions of this article defining justifiable use of physical force, conduct which would otherwise constitute an offense is justifiable, like choking somebody, and not criminal when such conduct is necessary as an emergency measure to avoid an imminent public or private injury which is about to occur by reason of a situation occasioned or developed through no fault of the actor, and which is of such gravity that according to the ordinary standards of intelligence and morality, the desirability and urgency of avoiding such injury clearly outweighs the desirability of avoiding the injury ensuing from using force on the person. A person may, subject to the provisions of subdivision 2, use physical force upon another person when and to the extent that he or she reasonably believes such to be necessary to defend himself, herself, or third person from what he or she reasonably believes to be the use or imminent use of unlawful physical force by such other person. Um, unless, everything after the unless and in section 2 limits when you can use your force, when you can use force. The critical thing here is that Batty McBad Guy must be doing something or about to do something that justifies the use of force against him. If he's either not doing that thing or no longer about to do that thing, force is no longer authorized. Now let's say that he's about to do a bad thing, and Captain America puts him in a chokehold and renders him unconscious. On to question number 2. After Batty McBad Guy is unconscious, when it's okay for Captain America to continue to choke him? The point I'd like to make is that there are situations we can come up with where the answer to question number 1 is sometimes, but there are no circumstances, according to New York law, where continued use of force is acceptable, because the guy's unconscious and can't possibly be engaged in any conduct which justifies continuing to choke them. A point I keep trying to make is that putting someone in a choke and rendering them unconscious can be a reasonable thing to do, but once you've done that, you have a responsibility to manage the person you just rendered unconscious, because they can't do it themselves anymore. Even if you were to consider a situation where Captain America can righteously choke Batty McBad Guy unconscious, Captain America becomes a murderer when he decides to maintain the choke until Batty McBad Guy is dead. Because it can't be called unintentional or an accident unless somebody just doesn't know what the potential lethality of choking someone when you've already rendered them unconscious is. And it seems highly implausible that Penny didn't know any of this. He went through the training, and the training, as this guy mentioned, makes a point of emphasizing, look, this technique could kill people. Don't use it unless you absolutely have to, and don't use it more than the amount of time it takes to render somebody unconscious. He goes on to say, we only have partial video, so I'm not sure if we'll ever know exactly how long he held the choke, but we know it was on the order of minutes, not the seconds required to render someone unconscious. And I've watched the video, and it looks like he was Neely was still moving past the point where a properly done chokehold would render somebody unconscious. So maybe he wasn't doing it correctly, but he certainly wasn't any threat, and he definitely was unconscious within a minute or so, if not less. And finally, he says, if he did not think the choke was effective, he was trained in multiple other techniques he could have transitioned to at any time. Or, he could have done those other techniques that he was trained to do for restraining somebody, such as the seatbelt grip that I showed you earlier. He could have done any number of things to restrain the guy if he really felt that he needed to choke him out, make him unconscious. He could have done that and then stopped. The fact that he continued to apply intentional effort to maintain the choke for several minutes, despite the fact that he was trained in the technique and, as far as we know, aware of what would happen if he kept it up, this guy says, makes him, in my opinion, a murderer. Now, regardless of what you think about Mr. Neely, there doesn't seem to be any reason at this point to believe that Mr. Penny didn't know somehow that he could seriously hurt or kill Jordan Neely by having her in a chokehold for that long. So, at this point, I really don't see how a jury could reasonably conclude that he's not guilty of involuntary manslaughter, the charge that he was charged with. And it seems like there could have been a greater charge. He could have been charged with murder, and it's possible he could have been convicted on that basis, because at the very least he was negligent here. he had a responsibility to make sure that he wasn't killing the guy, and he didn't do that. So anyway, you let me know what you think, but I think that this was certainly not a justified action by Mr. Neely, and he deserves to have a legal system uh, give him appropriate consequences for his actions. And just more generally, um, a lot of people, and I've seen many who have justified the killing and said that he was a quote unquote hero for eliminating a potential threat to people's safety and so forth. And typically, people who say things like this also say they believe in law and order. But what does law and order mean? Um, doesn't it mean that we don't live in the Wild West? We don't, that we don't have the law of the jungle, but law and order, where we have certain established procedures for dealing with potential threats to public safety that you know uh, we're legally obligated and morally obligated to follow, to make sure, for example, that somebody who is not a threat and hasn't hurt anybody, um, to make sure that they aren't unjustifiably hurt or killed. So, if Neely really was a threat, as I said, he could have been restrained in some other way that didn't run the risk of him dying. The cops were called and they were there within a few minutes, so he wouldn't have had to been restrained for that long. There were 3 people there who could have restrained him. Uh, there certainly was no need for him to be killed, and it's just a tragic situation for his family, whatever friends he may have had. And so forth, that this happened, and that if a precedent is established here, I mean, not that there haven't been precedents before. Bernard Goetz shot 4 kids to death who back in the 1980s on the New York Subway system. No, shot them but didn't kill them, but one was paralyzed. Just because they asked him for money, like panhandling. And he was found not guilty. Actually, there have been cases of people, white people in this case, getting off scot-free for harming somebody who hadn't harmed them. And another example, of course, was Trayvon Martin, the black teenager who was killed by a white vigilante who thought he was suspicious back, about 10 years ago. So, it would be nice to live in a society where people couldn't simply take the law into their own hands and just not suffer any consequences for it when they seriously hurt or kill somebody. And I hope that the case is decided in that fashion here. I hope he's found guilty of the charge that he's been charged with. All right, that's all I have to say about that. I will see you next time.